of the scattering, which is like the flood, out of the decreation of Babylon, which is like the decreation of the flood after Cain's city. After the city of Babylon is scattered, God selects the promised lineage and takes one, a guy named Exalted Father, Avram, and gives him a blessing and says, hey, go to this land. So Avram did exactly what God said to him. He was 75 when that happened. And you know, the first thing he did, well, he found a tree. He found a tree in that land, a really nice tree. That's cool. So he found a tree. It's called the Oak of Seeing. More means seeing. The Oak of Vision. And Yahweh was made visible to Avram at the Tree of Visibility. It's a wordplay. So the word more and the word appeared, they rhyme with each other in Hebrew. So Avram goes into this land and he finds a tree and God meets with him. Sarah's there, the whole crew, and God meets with them by the tree. Sweet. So, you know what? I'm going to do what Noah did. I'm going to build an altar. Yeah? So he builds an altar and he calls upon the name of Yahweh. And you're like, oh, right. This is great. This is great. We're reclaiming Eden and we're replaying Mount Ararat all together at one here. From there, he went to another place, you know, a really tall hill, a mountain. And, you know, he pitched a tent right on that hill. Do you see what's happening? So we are joining the pictures of Eden, the tree on the hill where you meet with God, Noah on the hill where he pitches his tent in the garden, and we're blending those two because this is humanity 3.0. Adam and Eve were one, Noah and his wife were the next. Here we go. This were a musical. This is where you're hearing the same notes, but with a new instrument, with a bit of a twist. But you recognize the melody. So, man, you got a husband and a wife in a new Eden, meeting with God by a tree. What could go wrong? Well, what was God's promise is, listen, I'm going to give you a huge family. And, well, a few chapters on, Sarai, Avram's wife, had borne him no children. You learn in the sequence of the story, she's what's called barren, akara. It's really a word describing trees. She was without root. She wasn't rooted to the water source that brings forth life. She's unrooted. So they have no kids. So they do, however, have an Egyptian slave that they picked up when Avram deceived the king of Egypt. So how about this? Maybe I can build up myself through her, have sex with my slave. And Avram listened to the voice of Sarai. If you just make a little note, that's exactly what God says to Adam about what happened at the tree. You listen to the voice of your wife, who had listened to the voice of the serpent. And so Sarai took Hagar and she gave her to her husband. Just like the woman at the tree in Genesis 3, she took from the fruit and she gave to her husband. Now Sarah takes the slave, gives her. Are you tracking here? This is how they do it. This is how the biblical authors do it. So they're using a painting metaphor. They're using the colors and the shades from the Eden portrait, and they're now painting this story using Eden colors in terms of these repeated words. And so, lo and behold, what happens in this story is you have deception and mistrust of God and the blessing. And so instead of rival brothers, what you first get is rival wives. Rival wives. And just think here, the Yaakov story. Rival wives. And so you have two wives, one who's going to be the wife of the chosen lineage, but one who's not. And in this story, Hagar, who's the non-chosen, flees to the east and exiles herself. And then what she's told is that, hey, listen, the son that you give birth to is going to be at odds and in conflict with everybody, especially the promised son when the promised son arrives. So it's all of a sudden, the division in the family is now being doubled. Rival wives who give birth to rival sons. The firstborn, non-chosen, Ishmael. Secondborn, chosen, is Isaac. However, God is really ticked at what Avram and Sarah just did to their slave. And so in the next chapter, he orders Abraham and every generation that comes after to chop off a part of their body that he just used to sexually abuse their slave. So it's called circumcision, but it's the narrative right after the sexual abuse of Hagar. And so that the fact that those two are next to each other is meant to make you ponder. And that's a whole thing. Again, if you're online, you can pause and go take the Abraham course right now. We don't have time. So what happens here is this is a great example of how the melody works. So what you expect to happen now is some kind of flood, some kind of escalation of a crisis. And isn't it interesting that the story after Hagar and Abraham and Sarah, that story just gets put on pause. And the story shifts in Genesis 18 to begin the story about Abraham's nephew. And where did Abraham's nephew go? Oh, yes, he went down to the great city, the city of Sodom. Yeah. And what God says to Abraham is, hey, listen, the outcry against Sodom and Gomorrah is so great. I've got to do something here. So I'm going to send some messengers down, and they're going to investigate the city. And what do they find? It's a city of bloodshed. It's a city of great violence. And so what God does is unleash a flood of not rain, but fire. It rains 2 times in the book of Genesis. It rains at the flood, and it rains fire on the city of Sodom. So this becomes our decreation, curse and exile and decreation. And then out of that story is a really weird one, because who's rescued out of Sodom? Abraham's nephew. And what do? They go up to a mountain, don't want to be on the mountain, so instead they go to a cave. And is the seed preserved? But in this really weird way, where the children get their dad drunk in the nighttime cave to preserve the line of their seed. Do you get it? Do you get it? So what Lot's daughters do to him with wine in the cave is the melodic replay of what Ham did after his dad was drunk in the tent. Do you see it? So all of a sudden you're just like, oh man, it's a really dark, perverted version of the melody. But, humans. And I mean, we're laughing, but humans. It's humans doing what's good in their eyes. And what the daughters, anyway, it's the whole thing. Sorry, I'm sorry. But the whole point is, look at how they'll, in order to complete the melody, they'll put stories in what to us seems like, that's a weird way to tell the story. Why did you put it in that order? And because the Hagar and the story of Ishmael, like, what's going to happen with all of that? And it's like that whole thing gets put on pause, follow the melody, and then you pick it up again. So what's going to happen once that story's over is you're going to come back to Abraham and Sarah, and they are sitting by the tree of Mamre, by their tent, and finally Sarah gets pregnant. This is in Genesis chapter 20. And so what God forces Abraham to do is to give up both of his sons. So these sons represent God's promise to Abraham. This is important for the Yaakov story. And so these sons represent the future of the promise of God's blessing. But the way that Abraham and Sarah got these sons is this sad trail littered with carnage and broken relationships and sexual abuse. And so what God is going to force Abraham and Sarah to undergo is a total surrender of the future of their family. And so there's two stories in Genesis 21 and 22 where God first orchestrates the banishment of Hagar and Ishmael. And it's because, well, actually God doesn't orchestrate it, it's because of Sarah's selfishness. And God allows her selfishness to drive Hagar and Ishmael away. It's a really sad story. And so Abraham has to pack up, basically lunch for his firstborn son and one of his wives and send them off, and he never sees them again. And then the next story is about the binding and near sacrifice of Isaac. And so what's important about that story is you have a story of a father and a son. And God asks Abraham, he tests Abraham. The story begins, I'll just show it here, Genesis 22, verse 1. It's all a great test. Genesis 22, verse 1. After these things, God tested Avram. So this is going to be Avram's ultimate test about will he do what's good in his eyes or not. And so what God says is, give me the life back of the son that I gave you. Which seems like a total contradiction in the story so far, because you're like, no, I think the snake crusher is supposed to come from this line. How does this make any sense? But that's what God asks him to do. And what we know is that in the past, when Abraham hasn't trusted God's word, it led to death and division, not life. But now it seems like obeying God's word is going to lead to death. And that God is contradicting God's own promise. So he embraces the contradiction. And he walks up to a mountain called Moriah, which is another word play on seeing or vision, and built an altar. And he's about to offer up his son as a sacrifice when God says, stop it. Test is over. You pass. And God says, now I know that you trust me more than your own definitions of good and bad. And lo and behold, there's a tree that I didn't notice over there. And in the tree is a ram. And so the ram ends up as a substitute for the firstborn. And that is offered up to God. And God renews his covenant and his blessing. And then check this out. This is in God's speech after all of this in Genesis 22. In verse 16, by myself I have sworn. This is the covenant language. I'm swearing an oath, a covenant promise right now. Because you haven't withheld your only son from me, I will bless you, multiply you like the stars of the heavens, like the sand on the sea. Your seed will possess the gates of their enemies. In you, all the nations of the land will find blessing because you obeyed my voice. So you didn't know this. Remember, God said at the beginning, I'm going to bless all the nations through you. That's why you're chosen. But then Abraham and Sarah started to make all these stupid decisions, and all they ended up doing was bringing curse and pain to the people around them. And so what God forces Abraham and Isaac to undergo is a journey towards death, and they go right into the face of death. And at the moment of death, God provides a way through the substitute. And so the firstborn is substituted with the sacrifice that came from the tree. And what happens at that moment of surrender is God's covenant blessing to bless all nations again, because you did this thing. See, we're visiting Noah's on the mountain here, offering intercession. And it's the moment that Noah and now Abraham surrenders his own life and future to God. Is the moment God gives him life and blessing back. So that's just one of the ways that the Abraham story evokes the melody. And so when we get to the story of Yaakov, this is everything you're supposed to already know And there's actually a whole bunch of other things too that we'll talk, but we're only at chapter 25. And it's like, it's like a symphony that keeps working the melody, never identically, always through repetitions and versions. So as we go through the Jacob story, what I'm going to constantly be doing, we'll work through a section or a story,